It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Nunez History Lecture Series. We have a fantastic lecture tonight. Part of the lecture series mission is to preserve the historical knowledge of the local community, and this is an excellent example of that, in addition to being good cultural and intellectual entertainment. A few updates. First off, you might have noticed that the mascot is not here. The mascot is a little defective lately, and so we had to send it off to be checked out. The plan is, though, we finally gotten everything under control and done all our marketing research and all the modifications. And so the plan is to have the official unveiling, the formal unveiling of the mascot at the next lecture. So that should be an exciting thing. And also, we're in the midst of determining the lecture topics for next year. And so a lot of you might have seen the selection sheets out there where you can rank the topics. The idea is that you have until the April lecture, I believe it's April 4th, to turn in the sheets, or even a little bit after that. Sometime in mid-April, the Board of Directors will get together and discuss the topics and vote on it so that we can give the new calendar at the May lecture. So that's the plan. So you have plenty of time, but always get us that input. We appreciate it so we can figure out what you would like to hear. So now we'll move on to the lecture, to the good stuff. To introduce the lectures tonight, I would like to introduce Mr. Brian Keating, who's the Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs here at Nunez, and a veteran himself, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Curtis. These new lights, I don't know if you all have been in the auditorium since we had all the new lights in, but you can't see. I can see a few reflections right here, and other than that, I can't see back at all. So if a little hazy, that's okay. There, we bring the house lights up, and that's a lot better. I can see out into the audience. It gives me a great deal of pleasure tonight to introduce our special guest. But before I do that, I would like to welcome everybody to Nunez Community College on behalf of our Chancellor, Dr. Warner. Tommy was stuck on the road. I know everybody knows we had some really nasty rain this evening, and he was up in Baton Rouge until a few minutes ago, and just walked in a couple of minutes ago, and I was going to turn it over to him, and he said, no, you run with it. So on behalf of Dr. Warner, I would like to welcome you to Nunez. Curtis has mentioned a little bit about this series. It's been going on for about 4 years now and continues to grow and be a vital part of Nunez Community College. The guests that we have tonight are two veterans, one from the World War II era, one from the Korean War era. And in our history, we go back, there are many, many conflicts and wars that the United States has been in. And I heard a little phrase the other day. I was actually watching a fishing show, and somebody on the show said, "You've got to experience it to own it." And the phrase just sort of passed in one ear and out the other last week. And as I've thought about it today, the experiences of being in combat, in war, in live fire, it is something that you have to experience to own and to actually know what that experience is about. The two gentlemen that are with us today have had that experience, and we'll share some of that ownership with you tonight. So without taking up any more time, Ron Chapman will do an overview before our two speakers, and then we'll introduce Mr. Tillery and Mr. Kingston. There are a couple of guests in the audience that they asked that be recognized and will be available for questions later. Mr. Noel Binder who was in the Army, no, I'm sorry, Navy. Oh, boy, I'm in trouble now. Mr. Noel Binder, who was in the Navy. Bobby Vetter, we're not sure that Bobby made it, and I can't see out there real well. And Mr. Kenny Odney, who was also in the Army in that era. I don't know if he's out there. But if those gentlemen come in, they will be on stage after the presentation to answer a few questions. With that, let me turn it over to Ron. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on the stage with veterans from 3 Pacific Wars here. Brian served in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. I'm going to just give a very quick 5-minute overview. We refer to this as the Great Pacific War because from our perspective, there's the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and World War II. But from the Korean perspective and the Asian perspective, there's just one great war. It goes back centuries. Just look at the situation in Korea in particular. It goes back to Genghis Khan. From there, you have in 1860, coming into more modern times, in 1905, China, Russia, and Japan continually going to be fighting over control of Korea. They're going to be in the crossroads of these conflicts of these major nations. By the turn of the century, at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Japan wasn't expected to defeat a great European power, but it was able to do so. And when it did so, it gained occupation of the Korean Peninsula. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea, which means basically they took absolute control over the peninsula. In the 1930s, when Japan began its expansionist militaristic operations, the Korean Peninsula was one of the points from which they launched into China. In 1945, the struggle of the occupation of Korea would then erupt between the United States and Russia because we were allies in the Second World War. However, soon after the collapse of Germany, we realized that Russian aspirations weren't necessarily peaceful, and when the focus turned then to the Japanese theater of operations, our concerns were what were Russia's intentions. So the Japanese War from 37 to 45 and the Korean War from 50 to 53 actually merge on the Korean Peninsula. This here map demonstrates the extent of Japanese expansionism prior to 1937. You can see the entire Korean Peninsula and Manchuria has been occupied, and the red line on the outside here, you can see areas where the Japanese are further extending themselves. This is the theater of operations in 1941, where you can now see, by looking at Manchuria, how far the Japanese have gone. If you look up at the top there, you'll see the Sakhalin Island. I don't know if I can get it without doing any damage right here. And these are the Kuril Islands up along the top here. The Russians still occupy the Kuril Islands and the Sakhalin Island. This is a point of conflict between the Japanese and the Russians to this day. This is the actual map layout of what the invasion of Japan was going to be involved in. So when Mr. Tillery was operating in the Pacific Theater, he was on Tinian Island at the time. I'm sure these plans were being drafted. And this was the invasion of Japan, which we expected to cost between 250 and 500,000 American lives, and perhaps over 1 million Japanese lives. That didn't take place because of that. Once the atomic bomb was dropped, it accelerated the process of peace in Japan. Russia at this point was now turning its eyes to the east, and the question was, if Russia joined with us in pushing the Japanese out, what territories would they occupy and how long would they keep them? This is a Russian advances in 1945. This blue area, you can see they're penetrating into Manchuria. End of World War II. After August 9th, 1945, the plans for an invasion of Japan changed. No longer were we concerned about invading, now we're worrying about a surrender. Interesting point here is the chief of the policy section, Colonel Charles Bonesteel, had 30 minutes, if you can imagine that, to draft a plan for Japan's surrender and to settle out a Korean occupation. 30 minutes. Concerns were growing over Russia's aspirations in the area. If you look back at the earlier things I had stated, you'll see that as back as 1905, they were fighting over Korea, so Stalin saw this as an opportunity to step in and occupy the entire Korean peninsula. Bonesteel realized then if he wanted to keep the Russians at bay, he had to draw a line somewhere on the Korean peninsula to separate that nation between American field of interest and Korean field of interest. Okay? But he had to draw that line so that both sides would accept it, Stalin and Truman. And this was a difficult problem primarily because the Russians were in a position to occupy it if they weren't satisfied with the agreement that came up. As a result, Bonesteel turned around and decided to give the Russians a little bit more than Truman wanted, but he convinced Truman that if he gave him less, the Russians might move into the area. As a result, the 38th parallel was set up as a demarcation line. Sharp differences had been existing in North and South Korea prior to this. When the Japanese occupied it in 1910 and annexed it in 1910 and occupied it throughout the 1930s and 40s, different groups came up that were in opposition to the Japanese. Some found comfort with the Americans, others found comfort with the Chinese and the Russians. This is the point when the war was over with. You have that period between 1945 and 1950 where tensions exist between these two elements in North and in South Korea. June 25th, 1950, 4 a.m. on a very rainy morning, North Korea suddenly decides to charge across the 38th parallel and invade South Korea and push the American troops that are present and the Koreans almost off the peninsula. September 1950, in defense of the South, the United States joins the fighting with the United Nations. Interesting sidebar to this. The reason it was able to take place through the United Nations, remember the Soviet Union was a member of the Security Council and they have a veto. Stalin elected at that point to protest in the United Nations and not participate. He boycotted. He swore he'd never boycott another meeting as long as he lived, because in his while he boycotted, the United States was able to pass through the invasion. October 1950, the United States now has advanced and is rapidly moving up the peninsula. China then becomes concerned about the ambitions of the United States, how far are we going to go, so they warned the United States, do not cross the 38th parallel. Later, it's October 19th, 1950, China decides to join the war on the north side. They sneak in across the border under cover of darkness. I think that Mr. Kingston will give you much more detail on that, and join the battle with the United States and UN troops. By mid-1951, the lines more or less stabilize, but you have 2 years of negotiations take place until finally July 27th, 1953. A new regime in Russia with the passing of Stalin takes over. The collapse of the Chinese offensive takes place, and as a result, peace reigns in Korea, if we can call it peace. The DMZ is still present. This is a map of the Korean Peninsula, and it shows where the 38th parallel is. And if you see down here, you can see the point where the Americans and the Allies were pushed off initially. This is the Alshan invasion, working all the way up. And the area that Mr. Kingston will be involved is actually a little bit off the map. This was the major battle at the Chosun Reservoir. Okay? So the Korean War was one of the most destructive of the 20th century. Perhaps as many as 4 million Koreans lost their lives throughout the peninsula, 2/3 of them civilians. As comparison, the Japanese would lose 2.3 million in the Second World War. China lost up to 1 million soldiers. The United States lost 54,246 dead and 103,284 wounded. Other UN nations suffered 3,322 dead and 11,049 wounded. So that basically is a synopsis of what was taking place between 1941 from the American perspective and 1953. So with that, now I'll turn the podium over to Mr. Tillery, and what he'll be giving you is not maps and strategic positions, but what it's like from the soldier's perspective. Thank you.
This is the most painful, excruciating and painful process at this very moment, I guess, when I'm looking at you and you're looking at me, wondering whether we understand each other. But I feel like I'm among friends. I like the music. Nostalgia, I guess. Those of you who are my age or perhaps a little younger would remember the songs from the Second World War. Remember Pearl Harbor? You're in the Army, Mr. Jones, no private lines or telephones. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. You all remember those. I like the program where it said that I would deliver a lecture. You know, any country lawyer or country politician can make a speech, but delivering a lecture is, little more intellectual, I suppose, like you have something to pass on to people. Kind of puts me in the same category, I guess, with Chancellor Warner and Professor Chapman. I like the idea of lecturing rather than speaking. When I was a young boy growing up in the piney woods in North Louisiana, every Sunday morning we were expected to be on the first row of a little clapboard church, sort of a rural area, about like Chalmette was, I guess, 25 years ago. I can always remember the preacher coming out, very virile young man, and he would walk out onto the platform and hold the book up in his right hand and say, "It's all been said, it's all been said." And then he would walk over to the pulpit, put the book down, and for an hour and 30 minutes say it all over again. Much to the consternation of the 10-year-old boy sitting on the front row, who had been told that surely a bolt of lightning from heaven would strike them dead if they caused any trouble for the preacher. But I guess it's part of what we do. It's part of our culture. It's part of what makes us what we are, the retelling of stories. From the Chinese philosopher I Ching said, I think, "If all the tales are told, retell them, brother, and if few attend, let them listen and also let them feel." Tonight we're going to talk about the common soldier, the ordinary soldier. And I don't demean any of them by using those terms. Abraham Lincoln said God must have loved the common man because he made so many. I really don't think Lincoln said that. I doubt that Lincoln said a lot of things that we attribute to him. I think he's probably like Yogi Berra. If he came back, he would say, "Those things I said, I didn't say." And I think that's probably true. But the Second World War was unique in one sense because it was every man's war in this country. A United States Marine division in those days consisted of about 15,000 men. And when they were strung out in a line for battle with 2 regiments in the front and 1 regiment in reserve, the rear portion of that army was called the rear echelon. The most advanced part of that army was the scout in front of the foremost combat patrol out facing the enemy, and that scout was called the point. And his job was to find the enemy first, to fire or be fired upon. It was to prevent the surprise of the main body. Now, a Marine assigned to the point was guaranteed to see a good part of the war because nothing stood between him and the Empire of Japan but the Japanese army, and it was his job to destroy that army if he could. I don't demean the valor of airmen who drop bombs from 30,000 feet, or artillerymen who dispatch shells over long periods of time and energy and space, or submariners who dispatched torpedoes at unsuspecting ships. There is simply a difference in the kind of war that men fought. War at the point was man killing man. It was like it was at Thermopylae, at Verdun, at Korea, and all the other wars that we fought. It was like Wyatt Earp at the OK Corral. It was like Matt Dillon on the streets of Laredo. To close with the enemy, to force your will upon him, to kill him with your rifle and see him dead at your feet, to watch the blood while it was still warm. That's what you saw at the point of a combat unit. To have violated all the rules of man so artfully promulgated and so conceived by man over so many years. Thou shalt not kill, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But my friends, vengeance was at the point, and killing was at the point. For about 860 days, I served with the United States Marine Corps during the Second World War, and a great portion of that was spent overseas in the South Pacific or Central Pacific. And I thought we'd talk about that tonight. And my story, again, is my story of the war. And don't judge me by anyone else. It's what I saw and what I heard and what I did and what I smelled. I heard an old soldier the other day from Washington standing before the monument there, and he said, "The older we get, the better we were." And I kind of like that. I thought that speaks well of us. But this is my story. It's personal unto me. Who were these Marines at the point with the rifle pointed out at the other man? 17, 18, 19, and 20 years old, most of them. You could join the Marines in those days if both parents consented to it and if they signed the papers. And I had men in my squad 18 years old. By 1943, the draft was reaching deep into the barrel. We had men in my unit, I'm sure, were 35, maybe some 40, not too many. Some had children, not too many. Some were married. Most were young boys, 17, 18, and 19 years old, who put on a green uniform and went to war. Everybody went. If you didn't go, you were either incapacitated, or you were married with a number of children, or you were needed on the home front as a physician or a technician of some kind. I guess I had only been in the Marines 6 months when I began to get letters from Burma, from Australia, from North Africa, from China. My friends were all over the world, and we heard from them every day. My mother had a map on the wall in her bedroom. My brother was in the Pacific also, and she kept pins on it, and she followed us around the Pacific, trying her best to determine where we were and whether we were still alive, I guess, from day to day. Did we know why we went? Yes, we knew why we went. We knew that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. We knew that Hitler had ambitions for world domination. And we also had a president who was able to communicate to us in words that made us understand why we fought and why it was necessary that we fought. Why did these boys fight? It's not natural to fight. It's not natural to kill people. You know, Herodotus, the great Greek historian, who is the father of history, I suppose, he tells about the Battle of Thermopylae, where they sent the men into battle, and behind the rear men, the captains came with long whips. And that's about what it sounded like, I would imagine. I couldn't do that if I tried. But the whips forced them into battle. Men didn't want to go, but they forced them into battle. In the Civil War, after the Battle of Bull Run, when the Yankees were going back into Washington, officers trailed behind them with the flats of their swords and hit them on the back, trying to keep them from retreating, bring them back into the war. General Eisenhower, during the Battle of the Bulge, when he was short in the Ardennes forest, there were 3,000 or 4,000 American deserters in Paris. We don't like to talk about those things, but there have been American deserters. And he was so disturbed about that, that Private Eddie Slovic, who is a well-known name to those who read about the Second World War, was the only American soldier who was executed for cowardice or desertion during the war, and the only one since the Civil War. And on a real cold day in the Ardennes forest, 6 Americans aimed bullets at his chest and killed him. Interesting part about that is there was a doctor from New Orleans, whose name I don't remember, who pronounced him dead. Fighting is not a natural thing. We have to be told why we fight, and we have to know why we fight. In the Middle Ages, people fought for booty. They fought for plunder. Their king said, take this castle or take this town, and you can have all the women there as your slaves, or you can have all the treasure that's there. In World War II, German officers stood behind the troops and shot them if they deserted. Now, we didn't have that kind of thing. We were civilian soldiers, as we have been told, but we knew why we were fighting. We had a reason for being there, and most of us did what we had to do. But did we know why we were there? Did we know that Japan had attacked us for a reason? Most of us did not learn that until later, as we came back and read books and found out that Japan had been on a rampage in the Far East for a long time, and that a good many Americans knew that war was inevitable. Some time ago, I guess 2 or 3 weeks ago, was the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, which was probably one of the most terrible battles of the Pacific War. And I sat there and watched, I guess for the 100th time, the raising of the flag on the top of Mount Suribachi. Joe Rosenthal won a Pulitzer Prize for that picture. And as I watched it and heard the songs in the background, I guess I could almost have put on a green uniform and gone again. But then reason took over from passion. And I can tell you right now, war was not at the top of Mount Suribachi. War was not that flag up there. That was a symbol of war. War was down on the beaches of Suribachi, where 5,000 Marines lay dead, some of them unburied on that date. Now that was war. One is the symbol of war, one is war, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. What kind of soldiers were these boys? Called them doughboys during the First World War, GIs during the Second. They tried to call them grunts during the Korean War, but that didn't work too well. But of about 10 million men and women who served in the armed forces of the United States during the Second World War, only 15% of them served in infantry companies or infantry squads, and that's soldiers with rifles who go out to fight, man to man, hand to hand in some cases. But of that 15% of infantry soldiers, they accounted for 70% of the casualties of the Second World War. If you didn't want to die, my friend, you didn't join a rifle company. That was a hard place to live. I did 3 assault landings in the Marshalls. You get up in the morning, about 4:30, I suppose, when the call says, and you know you're ready to go. You've been watching the bombardment of the battleships on the island all day long, and you wonder how in the world anybody could live on a small island that was only maybe 5 or 6 miles long and maybe 1.5 miles across. How could anybody survive that? But we had talked to the survivors of Tarawa who had fought 4 months before, 5 months before, and they thought the same thing. How could anybody live there? Until they got to the beaches of Tarawa, and in 36 hours, they had 1,000 Marines died on that beach. So we knew the Japanese would be there to meet us. I can remember standing, I guess, on that ship and looking there and wondering what it would be like to be in there. That was the night before. Now, a strange thing happens at 4 o'clock in the morning when reveille blows and you get up and the sergeant says, put your gear on, we're going in. And you're standing on the deck of the ship and you're looking at this island. And you're hoping maybe they surrender because maybe the Navy won with their big shells. But the sergeant walks down the line, very important man, a sergeant. He takes good care of you. And he called the roll. He looked at every man's dog tag. Matter of fact, I have my dog tags in my pocket. They brought me luck that day, and maybe they will again. You know, the dog tag is a little metal thing that you wore around your neck. You wore 2 of them. I think the idea was that if you were killed, one would be buried with you so they could find you later on, and one would be taken by the graves registration people. I looked at mine this afternoon. It has your name on it, it has your serial number on it, and mine has type A. And of course, that means if some erstwhile Hawkeye Pierce has to give you some more blood, he'll give you the right flavor. But also there is a big P on that, and that P stood for Protestant, which meant if I was killed in the war, they would have a Protestant chaplain say a few words over me rather than a Catholic priest or a Jewish rabbi. And my Catholic friend sitting out there who chides me about my Protestant upbringing is probably smiling at that. Really wouldn't make any difference which one did the job. We just hope it didn't happen. But that day, standing on the deck of that ship, I wouldn't say dramatically that I would never be the same again, because I don't think that's true. But it was a rite of passage from one part of your life to another. We have that in our lives. We have the bar mitzvah. We have the confirmation. The Indians in ancient times always had services of some kind for young men to initiate them into the adult process. And I guess that's what we were doing. But I can tell you that training stopped from that moment. The Marine Corps took over, and training took over, and I can remember the obscenity stopped, the jokes stopped. Killing was the agenda. That sounds melodramatic, almost sounds corny to say that, but it was in truth and fact what happened. We knew where we were going, and we knew what we had to do, and we knew we weren't coming back until we did it. Going in a Higgins boat, it's hard to remember. I see the Higgins boat downtown in the D-Day Museum. I think it holds, we said, 30, 35 men. I don't know whether you can see over the side or not. I have a memory of a boy sitting in the corner saying his beads, and I had never seen anybody do that. I did not know what that meant. realized now it was a prayer. But I didn't see much dramatics. I only wondered about that boat in the front of me, what would happen when the ramp fell. To tell you about the battle would be rather difficult, I think. I'll tell you one thing, thinking about this speech, I realize now that I spent a lot more time on that island trying not to get killed than I did in killing somebody. You try to stay behind something all the time. You try to stay with your comrades. There is safety in feeling that your sergeant's out there, that he will tell you what to do. You realize in the war in Europe was different. The war in Europe, take General Patton and his Third Army, they covered 20 miles, I suppose, and some days you would read in the newspaper that Patton's army covered 20 miles. They advanced 20 miles against the enemy. That meant nothing in the Pacific. Territory was not important. The Japanese army was important. The Japanese did not surrender. We knew that from practice, from reading, from watching them. The code of the samurai told the Japanese that dying was preferable to surrender, and that if you had to die for the emperor, you simply did. The cherry tree, the cherry blossom, is the sacred flower of Japan, the sakura no hana, they call it. The cherry blossom falls from the tree when it's in full bloom, unlike the magnolia and other trees that we see where it withers and falls. The cherry blossom falls when it's in full bloom, and the samurai takes his thoughts from that. He dies in the full bloom of manhood. He doesn't get wounded. He doesn't surrender. He would rather fight and die. So we knew if there were 1,500 Japanese soldiers on that island, we could not go around their flank, as Jackson did in the Civil War. We had to go right down the middle, hit them right where it hurt them. Now, the Army was different from the Marines. The Army had a theory of going slowly, but taking care of everybody that was in front of you. Kill everybody, obliterate all of their bunkers. The Marine Corps didn't. They believed in going through fast and coming back and mop up later. Sometimes that was dangerous because Japs like to play dead sometime and shoot at us from the rear, and they did that. Friends that you saw who were killed in battle, I remember coming back to the ship and the sergeant walking up and down cursing 2 men that I knew had been killed, and it was the strangest thing because he said over and over again, I told them not to get up and go back for ammunition, that we would bring it to them. And they violated his rule and they died. But battles don't last forever. You fight for 1 day, you fight for 2 days, maybe for 3 days, and then you're back aboard ship and you go to Guadalcanal or Hawaii, some of the larger islands, Bougainville, where there were times to have a regular camp where you could think, what did you do in those days? You hated to go back, I can tell you that. I think of these men now who come back from the war and have to go back a second time. You know, the first battle that you fight in is not so bad. The second battle is almost impossible, and the third battle is really difficult because you know what's there. You don't really know what it's like to see somebody dead that you know and you can't move or do anything about it. You simply suck it up and go. But you thought about all those. I guess war is the most dehumanizing thing that I can imagine, and we read about some of it now. It's as if there are no rules that exist whatsoever. Once you get accustomed to killing and destroying, it seems like it's almost contagious. On Tinian Island, where Japanese soldiers had been killed all over the island, it was not unusual at all to run into a corpse at any particular time. Seabees all over the island who drove cars, always on the ornament on their automobile, usually had a Japanese skull. And that's what they used until some general finally said that was too much. I remember one day working in the intelligence section where souvenirs were cleared by us before they could be sent back. A Seabee brings in one time a Japanese skull, which he had gotten, cleaned it up, polished it, painted it with a lacquer, put an ashtray in the top of it, made from a 20 millimeter shell, set it up on a beautiful piece of wood, and underneath the grinning Japanese face, it said, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Well, they almost executed him, but I think they finally got rid of him. I spent 7 months in a prisoner of war camp. I'm not doing too well tonight. I'm not thinking very well. I hope you'll excuse me, but I'm trying to think as I guess I feel. In a prisoner of war camp, I met Japanese soldiers. I had never met them before, and as most of you know, I knew some Japanese. I had gone to school. Survival, I think, was the main thing. Sometimes over the last 50 years or so, when I'm in a fancy restaurant or in a comfortable home, entertaining or being entertained, I hear a bon vivant in a clean suit say, "Why don't we send in the Marines and clean them out? Why don't we bomb them back to the Stone Age?" And I just wonder if he was ever there, that sender of Marines. I wonder if he ever saw the dead bleeding and smelling in the sand of a tropical island and knowing they would never come back. I wonder if he was ever there, or if he knew. And I guess if I could impress upon you anything that I feel, the reasons for war are sometimes good. Sometimes they're necessary. But don't forget the price. There is no glory in dying on a battlefield. It may be necessary, and it may be the patriotic thing to do, but there is no glory in it. There's no beauty in it. Sometimes on summer nights, when I'm having a hard time sleeping, and the summer lightning is cracking above my bed, it resonates with me, and I remember things that I have not remembered long before. And sometimes, I guess, as a country lawyer, I lay there worrying about the day. Did I impress the judge the day before? Did I write the right kind of brief? Did I do the estate plan for somebody properly so they would save taxes? I worry about things like that. And when I'm lying there between half asleep and half awake with my worry, I look at the side of my bed and I see a young Marine sitting there, about 19 years old, with a steel helmet on his head, carbine slung around his shoulders, with a cartridge belt around his waist with a grenade in it. And somehow he says to me in a quiet voice, "What's the matter, old man? You're going to make it. We're going to make it, you and I." And I feel comforted. And he says, "Remember those nights on Eniwetok in a hole in the ground with machine gun bullets over your head and Japs screaming and yelling in the dark? We got through that, you and me, and we'll get through this one." And then all of a sudden, I guess, in that twilight between sleep and waking, the last words that I think about is, "We survived. We survived." And that was all that mattered. We survived. I thank you for listening to an old soldier's story. I thank you for caring, but most of all, for me and for all of them, I thank you for remembering. Thank you.
I would like to now welcome Mr. Charles Kingston, who can give us his reflections on the Korean War. Mr. Kingston?
I was 18 years old in 1948, and the draft wasn't on, but you had to register at your local draft board when you were 18 years old, which I did. I had a cousin who was my hero and mentor, who was a Marine paratrooper. And he still lives. We talk practically every night. We tell our sea stories. He was in tremendous combat from Guadalcanal to Bougainville. I asked him what made him want to jump out of an airplane. He said, Charlie, we got extra pay. And he said, in order to do that, we flipped a coin, my buddy and I. It said, heads, we become paratroopers, and tails, we stay as infantry. I don't think at the time he didn't know that a paratrooper is infantry also. But he jumped in training, and he went with a group called Carlson's Raiders from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, where he was wounded badly. And we talk about the different times. When I was 18, I went down to register, as I mentioned to you. And then a friend of mine in my neighborhood came up to me and he said, Charlie, have you registered yet? And I said, yes, I have. He said, well, are you going to wait to be drafted into the Army? I said, not me. I'm going into the Marines. Good, you're just the guy I want to talk to. There was a Marine Reserve unit on the lakefront, maybe a year old, 10th Battalion, all infantry. So he said, come with me. He said, you may like it. First night I went out, Sergeant said to me, young man, how old are you? I said, I'm 18. He said, good, you can join us if you'd like. I said, I would like to do that. Consequently, I was put in a machine gun platoon, where the sergeant told us immediately, we were all formed up together one night, he said, machine gunners have about a minute in combat to live. I said, that's nice. Why couldn't I have gotten into something else? The truth is, you follow your orders. I was put where we were needed. And we had a hell of a platoon, I must tell you that. We were all young, about 19, well, it was 18 at the time. There were 19-year-olds, 20 years old. And like the other gentleman said, there were a couple of guys who lied about their age and got in. And we went to summer camps for 2 years. And then, June 25th of 1950, the Korean War started. And President Truman had just made the statement that the Marine Corps was the military police of the Navy. Well, naturally, we became very offended at that, especially when you're on a ship of 2,800 Marines, you headed for combat. Anyway, we were all called active duty. All Marine Reserve units were called active duty all over the country, whatever duty stations could afford to send. Went to Camp Pendleton, which was the home of the 1st Marine Division. We were reclassified there, and one of 3 classifications. If you had combat experience or you were World War II, you were called combat ready. If you had 2 summer camps, you were considered standby for 4 weeks advanced combat training, which took place at Camp Pendleton. After that, after 4 weeks of advanced combat training, where we fired all the infantry weapons that you can imagine, including flamethrowers and bazookas and all that kind of stuff. And they taught you dig foxholes and use hand grenades properly, et cetera, et cetera. So at the end of the 4 weeks, a roster came out on a bulletin board. It was the roster of the 2nd draft. And they were in alphabetical order in those days, and at that time, I should say. And I looked and my name was on it. Well, we were to go to supply and draw a rifle, which was in Cosmoline, and that meant you were getting a brand new one. Well, a friend of mine from New Orleans who was in my machine gun platoon handed me this rifle, but he didn't look up to see it was me. And he said, "Okay, kid, you got your rifle?" Yeah. He looked up and he said, "Charles, what are you doing here?" I said, "I'd like to know that too." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm on the roster for second draft, going to Korea." He said, "Really?" And this is the God's truth. This man was about 6'3". His shoulders were tremendous. His waist was little. But when he looked at me, a tear came from his right eye. He said, "Charlie, take care of yourself." I said, "I sure plan to do so." Well, the next day, we gathered up our gear. We went to San Diego and got aboard a big APA ship, which brought us to Japan. And in Japan, we went to an old Japanese marine station. And we waited there for about 4 days. None of us knew why. We'd had our shots, although my outfit, my doctors or whatever, corpsmen, lost my records, my health records, and I had to get the damn shots all over again. And one was a cholera, and that son of a gun put a welt on my arm, and I still say I was the only Marine that went into combat holding his right arm. So I couldn't believe that, so I had to get them all over again. Anyway, foul weather gear was the key factor in what we were waiting for. And none of us really thought, especially being from the South, that we would be put in tremendously cold weather. And I was certainly one of those guys. But anyway, we got parkas with hoods on them. They were knee parkas, fully lined. We had woolen shirts. We had woolen underwear, long johns, which took every hair off your body wherever it was placed. We had shoe packs that were supposed to have been tested by the Army in Alaska. I don't know where the hell they must have kept them inside when they went in Alaska, because they weren't worth a damn. And I can attest to that. So, and we got a mountain sleeping bag. Now that was a clue. We must be going into the mountains, you know. So, it's laughable sometimes. And so lots of times it's good to keep your sense of humor, because if you don't, you'll lose it. Believe me, you will. And you go through all the passions. Okay. Having said all that, we landed at Wonsan. That was a port above the 38th parallel. And the Navy had cleaned out the port because it was mined, and it took a couple of extra days to get all that done. Well, when we went ashore, we were told to go to the school, and we would be served some food in a chow line out of this building, and then we slept the night in the hallway of the school. The next morning, we went aboard a ammunition train that was headed for the various regiments. And as Mr. Torrey pointed out, in the Marine Corps, you have 2 on the line and 1 in reserve. We call it leapfrogging. And the 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment, the 5th Regiment in particular, was in reserve because they had taken the island of Wamido and went into Incheon, and the 1st and 7th were at the point. Well, we were there 2 days, and if any of you out there ever heard of Chesty Puller, who was the most renowned Marine at that time, a helicopter comes in, and the sergeant, the day before, that afternoon, I should say, 3 of us had reported from the second draft to go to 3rd Battalion, 5th. And he said, "Now you guys have got clean dungarees, and I know you got a clean rifle because you haven't used it yet. And by the way, before we left that school, we were issued ammunition, so we had been, given everything like that to go up to the lines. And he says, well, tomorrow morning at 0800, you will stand by down at the bottom of this mountain, and we are going to, you're going to stand in honor guard. So there was about 20 of us all together from various other companies. And sure enough, here comes this chopper. And first time I'd seen a chopper land, and this officer got off, and we standing at attention, looking straight ahead, not paying too much attention to who you looked like and what he was and who he was. So he walks up to the sergeant with the clipboard, and he says, all right, who's the first one? Well, this gentleman, what's his name? Harry Jones. Harry Jones, okay. He pins a Purple Heart on his chest, and he grabs his hand, he says, congratulations, son. The next time I see you, I want to see a cluster in that Purple Heart. That meant he was going to be hit over and over again, wounded. He went to the next guy who got a Bronze Star, and he said to him, congratulations, next time I see you, I want to see you with the Silver Star. So he went down the line doing this. Came back, and he grabbed one rifle, threw it at the guy grabbed it. So he goes back to the helicopter. And the guy standing next to me says, who the hell was that? And the sergeant said, you didn't recognize that officer? I said, no, sir. Well, who was he? He said, that was the Colonel Chesty Puller. Oh, my God. We felt dumb, you know. But here was this man truly with this chest where he got this name from. One of the most highly decorated Marines there was. Anyway, we went back and we were there about another day. Trucks came along and took us with our orders of the 1st Marine Division by General MacArthur, who was the commander-in-chief, was that we were to go up through the center of Korea and secure the chosen reservoir, which supplied hydroelectricity for 3/4 of Korea, just about. Well, we got up there on their Thanksgiving Day, which I think was a day ahead of us back here. And they brought turkey, dressing, and all that up to us. And by this time, snow was falling pretty hard. And I said to my foxhole buddy, I said, Don, something's going to happen. They're fattening us up for the kill. Everybody laughed at that. And then my captain was standing there. I said, sir, may I see you a minute? He said, what is it, Kingston? I said, I'd like to get a transfer out of this outfit. He said, what? A transfer? For what reason, Kingston? I said, where I come from, sir, it doesn't get below 38 degrees above zero, much less, it's freezing now. It was terrible. 38 to 42 with the wind chill factor, which was not factored in at that time, but one of my generals who was with us at the 7th, he was a colonel in General Davis, who passed away about 6 months ago, was said to have, he had a brother-in-law who became a weatherman, and he took the figures in whatever altitude and all, and predicted it was 100 below zero. Well, I can tell you it felt like 200 as far as I was concerned. Our weapons froze up on us except for an M1 Garand. Anyway, we dug in, and lo and behold, my buddy and I draw the 8 to 12 watch at the bottom of Item Company's mountain, and we're 50 yards away from the CP. Well, at 12 o'clock, we were relieved, and we went back and got into our shelter half with all our gear on, our rifles and everything. And about 2:30 in the morning, my buddy wakes me up and he says, Charlie, I hear rifle fire and I see flares. I said, oh, well, maybe it's some of those damn North Koreans who didn't get the word that they're beaten. Well, we heard a couple of bugles, and all of a sudden, there were enemy soldiers down in our CP, where he and I had stood guard from 8 to 12. Well, everybody broke out of their shelter halves, were issued grenades, fixed bayonets, and some encounters were hand-to-hand that night. We fought all night long. Our ambulances were machine gunned, killing everybody in them. Our exec was killed that night. We lost a lot of men that night particularly. After laying there until daybreak, we were sent, several of us were sent out on patrol to engage the enemy or find out where they were. They had pulled away, took all of their wounded with them and their dead. And there were remnants of satchel charges that they would put on a bamboo rod and push it to your lines and hope that that would take care of you in a foxhole. So then, the battalion commander, who was a fantastic officer, and I've said this many times, he was one of the finest officers anyone could have over them, and I would have followed him to the ends of the earth, because he looked out for his men. He made sure the supplies were there. That night when we were under heavy attack in the CP area, I wanted to tell you this, and I'm going to digress from the colonel just a minute. The guy laying next to me, God, I don't remember his age, but his face was so wrinkled, it looked like he had been in the Sahara Desert every day for 20 years. He was an old buck sergeant. And he knew I was a kid, afraid, and I was. He taps me on the elbow with his elbow, and he says, "Son," I said, "Yes, Sarge." He said, "Stick with me, kid. I'm going to get you the hell out of here." I never saw him again. But we were rallied the next day by our commanding officer, and he told us what the problem was and what we had in back of us, because we were completely surrounded by not Koreans, but Chinese communist troops who were seasoned troops. They had been fighting Chiang Kai-shek. The next thing was every maybe 10th or 12th, 15th weapon we picked up was a U.S. sub-Thompson machine gun, which they confiscated from Chiang Kai-shek. Now, we're completely surrounded. 10 Chinese divisions came over at night. They had white uniforms on so they could lay in the snow and they would not be detected by air. And we took some prisoners. We weren't allowed to take many because we had no facilities, but we needed to find out who these people were, how many were in the area. And I had to take a kid about 15 years old, I'd say, who was wounded in the shoulder, had a service wound, and march him to our G2 section so they could interrogate this guy to find out what was around us. And he told us about the bands of 250, and he gave us his division number. Now, here's what they had to fight us. They had one bandolier of ammunition, a bag of opium, and a rifle. And some of them didn't even have shoes. Their feet were frozen. These people, I don't know how the heck they survived, to be honest with you. But as one outfit would, or one unit would be demoralized or killed a lot, then they knew they had to man up with other people. So it didn't disturb them one iota. They had to kill Americans, and their mission was to kill and annihilate the 1st Marine Division because they knew, in all candor, we were the best trained troops put in the field. And so they came at us hot and heavy. And for about 12 to 14 days, we were hit constantly, sometimes during the day. At night, they knew we were tired because we were ordered back. That in itself was demoralizing. I told my buddy, I said, the Marine Corps has never retreated. He said, Charlie, we're following orders. Now, a general was told that, Oliver P. Smith. He was told that we were retreating. He said, retreating, hell, we're attacking in another direction. There are more gooks behind us than there are in front of us. And he was right. Well, we fought for those 14 days or thereabouts. We killed a lot of them. They killed a lot of us. And came a time when they said, okay, we're going to continue to walk. There was only one road in and one road out. I thank God for our Navy and Marine pilots who flew Corsairs, that were World War II fighters, and they dropped the napalm, they machine gunned, they were perfect for infantry. A woman followed me, a North Korean woman, followed me for 2 days with 2 children, one in each arm, because I had given her 2 cans of pet milk. A field hospital, a field cooking station was breaking up, and he said, grab everything you can. So I told my buddy, I said, listen. And by the way, we were dropped sea rations from World War II. And how did I know they were World War II? You open the book of matches up, and it says, keep your sleeves down, mosquitoes cause malaria. I said, I'd like to meet the damn mosquito that could survive in this stuff. So we were dropped. We had to share the sea rations. We got 1 can of meat and 1 can of little cakes like. We had no water. We were eating snow. And I didn't know snow would not completely quench your thirst. But to us, it was great. We just pick it up and eat it. And we got down to another cooking station, and they had left about 25 pounds of bacon, raw bacon, out on the table. And I said to my buddy, I said, hey, look at this. Let's start eating this. Now, I had heard about trichinosis in high school, but it didn't affect me because I was hungry. I had to eat something. He had to eat something. The sergeant came along and he says, what the hell are you doing? I said, well, we're eating this. He said, do you know that's raw bacon? And that can cause trichinosis? We're not concerned about that. We're hungry. He said, don't let me see you do that again. So he walked off. When we did, we just went off too. This woman followed me after I gave her these cans of pet milk. And my sergeant came up to me and he said, Kingston, you cannot let that lady follow you any longer. I said, well, for what? He says, we're going to get in firefights, and she and those 2 children may be killed. And I realized he was right. Now we get in the food, we get ammunition by air, almost every day when the weather permitted it. So we moved out. We came to a place where the Chinese had blew up a small bridge. And we got there at night. And the commanding officer came around and he said, everybody check their weapons. And I had an M1 Garand. And normally you just pull the boat back and you can push it forward. It would eject the round, of course. And I couldn't get that bolt to go back. I beat on it because we were told we were going over this bridge that either Marine Air Force or the United States Air Force had dropped some aluminum girders so we could go over this thing. And I did not know this till about 6 years ago, that at the other end, the things were short. So what they did was they took Chinese bodies who were dead and propped this bridge up with that. And we got our 6-plies over, and as soon as we did that, we went into a big firefight. The next morning, that woman was gone. I never saw her. I don't know whatever happened to her. We constantly were hit by these people. They would harass us, and I will tell you right now, quite honestly, I know I hold the 50-yard dash record. We got down to a plateau, and the gooks were in caves with machine guns, with a lanyard attached. That was an old Japanese trick, probably. By the way, the Chinese and the Orientals pretty much fight all alike. They fight till the death. And they know nothing about the Geneva Treaty and should care less. So what happened was, We knew we were surrounded, and we'd have to be forever vigilant. After we crossed this bridge that was flown in, and we got to other areas, and then, for some reason, in a big firefight, we became disconnected from our various outfits. But I'm here to tell you, excuse me, I'm here to tell you, thank God Marines are trained as number one, you are a rifleman. I don't care what other else your specialty is, you can be whatever, you know you're a rifleman. And when you're fighting, it's damn good to know you got a good guy on the side of here, over here, behind you. We fought together. We didn't leave anybody. We took our wounded out. We took most of our dead. Although at a place called Coterie, they dug this was halfway down, they took a bulldozer and took it was a North Korean vegetable cellar. And they dug that out, and I don't know how many Marine bodies are in that thing. We've never heard what a count was. We had British Marines with us also, who fought tremendously. And they were great. Those damn guys were clean-shaven every day in combat. They wore those damn berets, and they were good fighters. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, as Mr. Tillery said, it's tough to kill. It's hard to kill. But you know you must. And the old adage is, kill or be killed, is absolutely true. I cannot forget their faces when I saw them. I shall carry that to my death. See, because as this gentleman pointed out, we are different people. We are taught to respect life. And we try to do that as much as possible. And I must tell you that I experienced every passion that one individual could do. I was scared. I became bitter. I truly wanted to kill. They couldn't do what we saw them do to a lot of our guys. An ammunition convoy was trying to get up to us with Christmas mail and everything, and it was all over the road. One guy was pinned to the first truck, spread eagle. Told my buddy, I said, somebody's got to pay for this, man. And we became strong fighters, determined to what we were going to do. In summing up, I'm happy to be here to talk about my war. We still have 15,000 or thereabouts men who have never been identified by the North Koreans. Unforgivable. We should never forget those. Never. And I will end by thanking Chancellor Warner, Ron Chapman, Dr. Manning for the opportunity to let you know what another Marine in another time conducted himself, and I am proud, damn proud, that I served my country. And I'll leave you with this. Semper Fidelis is our motto. It means always faithful. We have been serving this country 229 years, and we're damn proud to have done it. Thank you.
Let's have another hand for all three of them. That was great. And now I'm going to ask all three of our lecturers to join us right here on the stage for a presentation of a plaque so we can get a picture and everything. So. Step up here. Come right over here so we can get in the name. All right. All right. So, thank you very much. Let's have another hand. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming and to announce to everybody that the next lecture is going to be April 4th. Our lectures are generally the first Monday of the month from 7 to 8, preceded by a great wine and cheese reception from 6:30 to 7. They're free and open to the public, so please bring friends. There's no registration or anything, and I look forward to seeing all of y'all at the next lecture. Thanks a lot.